Chapter 7. The Spread of Slavery. Tobacco and Unwilling Colonists. The English wanted New Amsterdam, now New York, because the rich fur trade could make money for England. So far, the other English settlements in America hadn't produced much wealth. King James had hoped that the Jamestown colonists would find gold, but the rich soil of Virginia held no jewels or precious metals. But soon Virginia's ground brought England another kind of gold, green gold. And like the gold of South America, this green gold would bring riches to some and misery to others. The story of Virginia's green gold began when a young Englishman named John Rolfe arrived at the Jamestown colony. Jamestown had been founded 2 years before, but the colonists were starving. They were ragged, poor, and wretched, struggling through long days of farming and huddling, still hungry, over their small fires at night. John Rolfe was sure that the colony would fail and that he would have to return to England. In the meantime, he had little food and nothing fun to do after a hard day of labor in the hot Virginia sun. But John Rolfe did have a few tobacco seeds, and like many Englishmen, he loved to smoke. Rolfe had already noticed that the Native Americans who lived near the colony grew a kind of tobacco of their own. They planted it, weeded it carefully, picked it by hand, hung the leaves up to dry over the smoke of a wood fire, and then rolled the leaves up and smoked them. Other colonists had tried this native Virginia tobacco, but they didn't like the way it tasted. Poor and weak, and of a biting taste, one colonist complained. But John Rolfe's seeds were Spanish tobacco, a rich kind of leaf that most Englishmen preferred. Rolfe found a fertile patch of land and planted his seeds. He copied the Native American methods of raising the plants, picking the leaves and hanging them up to dry. When he rolled up his leaves and smoked them, he was delighted. He thought that the Virginia-grown Spanish leaves tasted wonderful. John Rolfe shared his tobacco with a few other colonists. They agreed. The leaf tasted wonderful. Together, the colonists grew a few more plants and sent some of the tobacco to London. London was full of tobacco users. All the most fashionable young men of England smoked. They blew so much smoke out of their mouths and noses that they were called reeking gallants. Often they had servants who did nothing but follow them around to taverns, balls, and theaters, carrying their tobacco equipment. A German visitor to England marveled, "Everywhere, the English are constantly smoking. They draw the smoke into their mouths and puff out again through their nostrils, like funnels, along with plenty of phlegm from the head." But until now, the English had been forced to buy tobacco from the Spanish, and Spain and England were continually at war. If the English could buy Virginia tobacco instead, they wouldn't have to pay money to their enemies. London smokers purchased all the tobacco that the Jamestown colonists sent, and exclaimed over the new leaf. "No country under the sun may or doth afford more pleasant, sweet, and strong tobacco," one Englishman marveled. Merchants begged for more. The Jamestown colonists realized that although they had no gold, they might have something better. Only 6 years after Rolfe first planted his seeds, the Jamestown colonists were planting tobacco everywhere, even in the streets of their town. By the following year, England was buying more tobacco from Virginia than from Spain. Not everyone was pleased with English smoking habits. King James wrote an essay called "Counterblast to Tobacco," in which he announced, "Smoking is a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs, and in the black, stinking fume thereof, nearest resembling the horrible Stygian smoke of a pit that is bottomless." Englishmen kept right on smoking. By 1630, Virginia was sending over 500,000 pounds of tobacco to England every year. But raising tobacco took an enormous amount of work. The seeds had to be hand-planted, hand-weeded, and hand-pruned. Caterpillars and worms had to be picked off one at a time. When the tobacco plants were ready, the leaves had to be taken off one at a time and hung on pegs to dry for 6 weeks. Then the stems had to be taken off and the leaves packed, one at a time, into barrels. One farm worker could only take care of 2 or 3 acres of tobacco. At first, tobacco farmers hired indentured servants, poor Englishmen and women who agreed to work for a colonist who paid for their journey to the New World and gave them food and a place to live. After 6 or 7 years, the colonist would give the servant a new suit of clothes and enough money to get started. The servant was now a member of the colony. Many Americans who began as indentured servants later became wealthy, important citizens. But as the tobacco fields grew larger, farmers needed even more help. In 1619, a Dutch trading ship threw down its anchor in the Chesapeake Bay and offered to sell African slaves to the Jamestown colonists. The colonists bought 20 slaves and put them to work in the tobacco fields. Although these Africans were the first North American slaves, slavery itself was nothing new. For at least 100 years, European traders had brought slaves to the plantations of Central and South America. They would load their ships with metal knives, pots and pans, cloth and rum, and would sail down to the west coast of Africa. There they would dock their ships and meet with African war leaders who had taken members of other African tribes as prisoners of war. The war leaders would trade these prisoners for the European goods. Then the European ships would sail across the Atlantic to the West Indies, the islands of Central America, trade the slaves for sugar, molasses, and cotton, and sail back to Europe. This became known as the triangular trade, because the ships followed a triangular pattern. But now slaves came, not just to the Portuguese and Spanish colonies in Central and South America, but to North America as well. At first, Virginia bought only a few hundred slaves per year, but the tobacco fields grew larger and larger. Other colonies south of Virginia began to plant not only tobacco, but also rice and cotton. These fields also needed thousands of laborers to tend them, water them, and harvest them. More and more slaves came to North America, thousands, and then tens of thousands per year. 100 years after the first slaves came to Jamestown, almost half of the colonists in Virginia were slaves. The Virginia tobacco plantations prospered, but only because of slavery, and these unwilling colonists could never earn their freedom or return home.